Hi everyone, welcome to our webinar today. The topic of this webinar is Hawaii's 100% RPS and Vermont's new RPS. This webinar is a presentation of the Clean Energy States Alliance, also known as CESA, and this webinar is being presented for the State-Federal RPS Collaborative. We have guest speakers with us today from Vermont and Hawaii to talk about their RPS programs, and we are also joined by our host for this webinar, Warren Leon. Warren is the Executive Director for CESA, and he also manages the State-Federal RPS Collaborative. Before I pass it over to Warren, I'd like to go over a few quick housekeeping notes. All of our participants on this webinar are in listen-only mode. You have a couple of options for joining the audio portion of this webinar. You can call in using your telephone, or you can use your computer mic and speakers. And there's some instructions on your screen there for connecting that way. A very important note, we ask that you please submit your questions throughout the webinar as you think of them by typing them into the question box on your webinar console and hitting send. We'll be reading through your questions throughout the webinar. We will have some time at the end of our presentations for a Q&A with the presenters, and we will get to as many questions as we can. So please do type your questions in as you think of them, and we'll get to as many as we can at the end. A final note, this webinar is being recorded. You'll find a recording of this webinar, as well as all of our previous webinars, on our website at cesa.org/webinars. And with that, I'd like to pass it over to our host for this webinar, Warren Leon.
Hi, thank you very much, Samantha. We have a very interesting webinar today, and as Samantha said, it's being hosted by the Clean Energy States Alliance, and we're a national nonprofit coalition of public agencies across the country, all working to advance clean energy, and you can see logos of most of our members right there on the screen. And one of the things we do, as you'll see in the next slide, is that we manage the State RPS Collaborative, and it's something that's funded by the Energy Foundation and the U.S. Department of Energy. And the collaborative includes basically anyone who's interested in renewable portfolio standards. We do webinars like this. We have a free monthly newsletter. We do research papers on topics of RPS interest. And if you want to make sure you get news about future RPS collaborative events, you can sign up by going to our website, cesa.org, and look under the project tab for information about the State Federal RPS Collaborative. So let me tell you about today's event. We're focusing on two states that last year took very important and impressive action to move forward with, in the case of Vermont, a new RPS, in the case of Hawaii, a much expanded RPS. And what's going on in these two states should be of great interest to many other states because their RPSs in various ways have leading and cutting-edge features. What I'm going to do is I'm going to introduce Veronica now, who's going to speak about Hawaii, and then after she speaks, I'm going to introduce our two speakers from Vermont, and then after they speak, then we'll have questions. So speaking about Hawaii is going to be Veronica Rocha, who's Renewable Energy Program Manager for the Hawaii State Energy Office. Now, the Renewable Energy branch that she leads provides technical assistance and permitting facilitation programs in order to advance the development of renewable energy projects in the state. Under her leadership, the Renewable Energy branch has guided the State Energy Office on key renewable energy strategies, such as removing barriers to renewable energy penetration through policy development, regulatory interventions, stakeholder engagement, and deployment of new initiatives. Prior to working at the Energy Office, she was Latin America Sales Manager for SOPOG, a Hawaii-based solar technology company. and before that she worked in engineering and management. So let me turn it over to Veronica, who's going to talk about the first state to have a 100% RPS.
Aloha, and Warren and Sam, thank you very, very much for having me today. I look forward to sharing a bit about what's happening here in Hawaii with regards to the 100% renewable portfolio standard. I'll start out by giving a brief background, and then I'll go into the legislation that Warren mentioned with regards to 100% RPS and a bit of where we are at now and where we're going. Okay, here we go. So, sorry. Okay, with regards to why Hawaii is doing this, most people know that we are the most oil-dependent state in the United States. We import 93% of our energy we imported 93% of our energy in 2014 from oil. We have the highest electricity rates, and just in terms of oil importation, it costs the state about $5.1 billion every single year. Our office at the Hawaii State Energy Office, we're part of the Department of Business, Economic Development, and Tourism, and we have the legal authority and responsibility for all of the energy planning, the policy making, and the programs in order to achieve the 100% RPS, but also more broadly speaking, everything having to do with energy. As we approach the advancement of renewable energy in Hawaii, we really do it from a balanced approach, meaning that we are guided by these 5 principles. So one would be diversifying our energy portfolio. Second, making sure, or at least trying to work towards connecting the islands to integrated modernized grids, because at this juncture they're not. And we believe that if they were integrated, that we could certainly take advantage of greater efficiencies and stability, reliability, et cetera, that would emerge from that. We're also quite concerned about balancing technical, economic, environmental, and cultural considerations, and not just pursuing renewable energy at any cost. 2 others would be leveraging our position as a test bed to launch an energy innovation cluster here in Hawaii. We're very privileged in that because we do have access to all sorts of renewable energy resources, Hawaii is and continues to evolve as a perfect place to test new innovations and technologies, whether it's wave or ocean thermal and others. And lastly, creating an efficient marketplace that benefits both producers and consumers. This slide shows the portfolio standards for both renewable energy and energy efficiency. The 2014 data that is reflected here is based on latest comprehensive state reports. Somebody did bring to my attention that the RPS report for the HECO companies, which covers Oahu, Maui counties, Big Island, has come out. So we'll need to update the slide, and also waiting for KIUC, which is our last utility. That would also need to be incorporated here. But nonetheless, we are, so 2014, we were at 21.1%. I think we're 22% now in 2015. The next slide shows the diversity of renewable energy resources and which ones are the greatest contributors towards a renewable portfolio standard. And as you can appreciate from this, it is quite a bit of a diversified portfolio, which is one of our key principles that I mentioned earlier. Last year, we had the privilege of passing Act 97. This set the renewable portfolio goal to 100% by the year 2045. It established really confidence in the market that this is a direction that the state of Hawaii wants to go to. And for us, it was very, very important to put forth this policy because we are cognizant that the RPS has done an excellent job at driving investment decisions and will continue to do so. But in order to go to 100% renewable energy in the future, we felt that we really needed to put it into law. Also last year, we passed the Community Renewables program. That was SB 1050, and it was approved as Act 100. Since then, HECO companies and KIUC submitted tariffs, and these tariffs for the community-based renewable energy programs are under review by the Public Utilities Commission. Our office worked very diligently not only on the passing of the law, but also has been working with stakeholders in finalizing and trying to finalize these tariffs as quickly as possible. I feel like there's a strong desire from various stakeholders to put forth these programs as it would help with the diversification of renewables here in Hawaii, as well as the advancement of renewable penetration. Since, and actually, even before the passing of the 100% renewable portfolio standard, the Public Utilities Commission had already started a power supply improvement plan proceeding, which stemmed from an integrated resource plan and initial power supply improvement proceedings. The integrated resource plan that was submitted, and I believe it was 2013, if I'm not mistaken, but don't quote me on that, was not, I guess, passed by the Public Utilities Commission, or accepted is the right word. So then the PUC, what they did, Public Utilities Commission, is that they issued this power supply improvement proceeding along with other proceedings that would complement this to help with the utilities planning. So the initial power supply improvement was submitted by the utilities, and I believe this was 2014. But then the Public Utilities Commission looked at the plans and said, they're still not up to par with expectation. And in particular, the PUC noted several observations, including the cost impacts and risks were not reasonable. The plans don't seek to aggressively seek to lower cost new utility scale renewable energy. The distributed energy utilization and integration was not addressed adequately, along with the several other observations. It also noted that since the plans were originally submitted, several other things had changed. So for example, now we have a 100% renewable portfolio standard, so that needs to be reflected in these plans. There have been substantial decreases in petroleum prices, so as we move forward, we need to procure competitively priced renewable energies. There's been changes even at the federal level, for example, the Clean Power Plan, mercury air toxins, etc. And also, Act 38, which I didn't mention previously, was also passed in the 2015 legislature. And basically what this act does is that it says that in terms of planning, that Hawaii will eliminate the use of fossil fuels, not only for electricity, but for transportation. So, sorry, here we go. Sorry, I'm having a little bit of trouble with the slides. Here we go. The Public Utilities Commission then told the HECO companies that they needed to resubmit the plans, which they did, and in fact, they filed an interim status report this February, on February 16, 2016, and the revised power supply improvement plans, those are due on April 1st. One of the things that I was very pleased to see in the interim status report that the HECO companies filed is that one of the themes that they're going to be looking at is whereby the RPS goals are going to be more aggressive than what are required by statute. So, for example, the next interim RPS goal is for the year 2020. So instead of looking at 30%, they're going to be looking at 35%. I was also very pleased to see that the HECO companies noted that they're committed to transforming the generation fleet so that 100% of the power generated comes from renewable energy resources. Another major plan proceeding that is underway has to do with the distributed energy resources. And this has a long history going back to the Reliability Standards Working Group, the Integrated Resource Plan, the Distributed Generation Improvement Plans, and most recently, Phase 1 of the Distributed Energy Resources was completed last year towards the end. And so what this did is that it stipulated revisions on the Reliability Standards Working Group for the PV subgroup. It closed the net energy metering program, but it established new programs, in particular the grid supply and the self-supply tariffs. It also modified the time of use tariffs, and it approved several advanced inverter functions. Okay. The distributed energy resources now, Phase 2 of it is underway, and the topics of discussion include opportunities to integrate and aggregate various forms of distributed energy resources. It's going to continue the assessment of technical integration challenges and ensuring safe and reliable integration of distributed energy resources, including evaluating the impact of legacy inverters, continuing collaboration with inverter manufacturers and parties on this proceeding pertaining to self-certification process and test plan for advanced inverter functions that were approved for inclusion in Rule 14H, and also for distribution level and system level hosting capacity. So now the other thing that's going to be huge for this proceeding is going to be developing and looking at proposals for establishing an appropriate distributed energy market structure, so whether it's time of use rates, dynamic rates, and others. As we move forward, we are currently in the 2016 Hawaii legislative session, and there are several key bills that we are currently evaluating. One of them is HB 2291, which is an RPS amendment. And what this does is that it amends the RPS definition to more accurately reflect the amount of renewable energy generation in Hawaii, but basing it on RPS by basing the RPS calculation on electrical energy generation instead of sales. So the current definition, which is renewable energy generation divided by all electrical sales, one, it's not apples to apples because we're looking at generation versus sales. And then second, without going into all of the detail, it basically overestimates the actual renewable energy generation that's serving all of our customers here in Hawaii. So we're currently looking to address this under HB 2291. We're also looking at SB 2738, which is a renewable energy technology income tax credit. I'll call it reevaluation, but essentially what it does is that it would reduce the current tax credit for solar energy properties, and it would take it from 35% to 15% after December 31, 2022. But it also creates room in the state budget for energy storage property tax credits. So that one has been advancing nicely through the legislature, and crossover happened last Thursday, not last year. So it'll be very interesting to see how this progresses through the remainder of the session. And then lastly, SB 2652 and HB 1689, there are two different versions of renewable energy fuels tax credits, which basically gets rid of the ethanol facility tax credit that has been in place for many years, hasn't been utilized to renewable energy fuels, for example, whether it's biofuels, hydrogen, others, and provides a tax credit for that. So with that, I'll turn it back to Warren. Thank you so much, and I look forward to answering any questions that you may have.
Hey, thank you very much, Veronica. And yes, we did get some questions that I'll be asking later, but people could write in more. And now we're going to switch to learn about Vermont. We were originally going to have 3 presenters, the first of whom was going to be Asa Hopkins, who's Director of Energy Policy and Planning in the Vermont Public Service Department. But he contacted us an hour ago that he had to go to his daughter's daycare where she suffered what we think is not a serious injury, but he has to take her to the doctor. So Tom Nauer is going to do the slides that Asa was originally going to do. And Tom Nauer is a utilities analyst and hearing officer at the Vermont Public Service Board. Tom serves as staff lead in regulating the state's energy efficiency utilities, is also lead in the implementation of the Standard Offer Program, and he works on other dockets addressing utility cost of service, rate design, and facilities siting. Prior to working for the board, he worked as an equities research analyst and did research and development as a battery scientist. After Tom speaks, Kevin Fink is going to speak, and then Tom is going to speak again after Kevin. But Kevin is a policy analyst with the Vermont Public Service Board, and there he works on the implementation of Vermont's new renewable energy standard. Before coming to the Public Service Board, he did policy and legislative analysis on energy, environment, and economic issues for a United States Senator. And so let me turn it over to Tom, and we'll go seamlessly into Kevin's presentation, back to Tom, and then we'll have questions.
Okay, thank you, Warren. Again, this is Tom Nauer and not Asa Hopkins, as the slide indicates. So I will attempt to convey Asa's points, and I will be probably briefer than Asa would have been. So Vermont, Asa's department publishes a comprehensive energy plan approximately every 3 years, and so the most recent one has these goals: to reduce total energy consumption per capita by 15% by 2025 and by more than a third by 2050. And I'll let everyone just read the second bullet. The current situation is Vermont has approximately 45% renewable in the state, and our goal is to increase that. Sorry, not our goal. The Comprehensive Energy Plan's goals is to increase that to 67% by 2025. For a little bit of history, I'm sure some of the attendees at today's webinar are aware that in the mid-2000s, the other New England states adopted RPS policies, but Vermont did not. We had what's called the SPEED program, which basically involved Vermont utilities entering into long-term stably priced power contracts with renewable energy generators, but the utilities were not required to retire the RECs. The legislature directed the Public Service Board to write a report in 2011, and so we did, and we recommended that the state adopt an RPS. And ASA has a note here that the 2011 version of the Comprehensive Energy Plan made a similar recommendation. The legislature considered those reports but didn't adopt an RPS. Further, the legislature directed the Public Service Board to write another report in 2013, and so we did, not making a recommendation as we had 2 years prior, but just outlining various policy options for the legislators to consider. Here, ASA says by 2014 the cracks were showing, and I won't characterize what ASA meant by that. However, the Department of Public Service worked with utilities and other advocates to develop a 3-tiered renewable energy standard proposal, and that was adopted and passed into law in the last session. There are basically 3 tiers. One is total renewable energy, where Vermont utilities can either retire owned generation or procure RECs on the New England market, and most likely these will be low-value RECs. There's an in-state DG requirement, and then finally an energy transformation requirement, which could mean additional DG beyond the Tier 2 requirement, and it could also be projects that are intended to reduce the fossil fuel consumption of their customers. And I'm going quickly through this because Kevin and I will be spending additional time describing these 3 tiers. And so with that, I'll hand it over to Kevin.
Great, thank you, Tom. That's me. So I'll start by talking about the first 2 tiers of the new RES. So the first tier, as Tom mentioned, is a total renewable energy requirement, which is basically an overall share of statewide electricity sales, and that starts at as a 55% requirement in 2017 and scales up eventually to 75% in 2032. It really is a total renewables requirement. There's not a specific types of renewable energy aren't specified. It's anything that meets the statutory definition of renewable energy, which we'll talk about a little later. In large part, as Tom alluded to, that is expected to consist of both imported hydropower. New York and Quebec Vermont already receives a large amount of hydropower under contract from them, and also other lower cost RECs within New England, and largely from existing sources. And that tier has an alternative compliance payment of $10 per megawatt hour, which sort of reflects the expected lower cost RECs. The second tier is a distributed generation tier. That is starts out as 1% of retail sales and scales up gradually to 10%. It is a subset of the total renewable energy tier, so energy procured under Tier 2 will count towards the utilities Tier 1 obligation. To be eligible in Tier 2, you need to be a new renewable energy source, you need to be under 5 megawatts in size, and you need to be connected to the subtransmission or distribution system of Vermont retail electric providers or part of a specific plan to defer transmission upgrades. And it's an alternative compliance payment of $60 per megawatt hour. And both of those alternative compliance payments scale up with inflation over time. So that's largely expected to consist of, new solar installations, new net metering installations, that type of thing. Act 56, which created the new renewable energy standard, was passed at the end of the last legislative session in, I guess it was the early summer of last year. So the board, which is tasked with implementing it, has been holding working group meetings with stakeholders to kind of collaboratively try to tease out some of the issues. And then the board is going to issue an initial interim order dealing with some sort of threshold issues, and later a final order implementing the program, followed by a formal rulemaking that will govern the overall program. Some of the challenges that the board is working on in sort of resolving some of these issues within Tier 1 and 2. Generally, Vermont is in a relatively good position because by being the last New England state to adopt an RPS, much of the infrastructure for tracking and monitoring compliance and that sort of stuff is in existence already, in particularly the NEPL GIS. However, there are some challenges in terms of using the GIS to track RECs, which is that for that imported hydropower that I mentioned that is not currently accurately reflected in the GIS, even though it is likely to count for the RPS or the RES. So we'll have to sort of figure out either how to bring that material into the GIS or to account for it without it. Another challenge is because Tier 2 is largely going to consist of smaller scale projects whose metering data is not necessarily reported to the ISO, it doesn't naturally find its way into the GIS. So we have to figure out how it's going to get there. The expectation is that utilities will aggregate that information and register it in GIS, but the board will need to look at the standards for verification and how we demonstrate that those numbers are correct and that the utilities actually own the recs that they're claiming through that process. One other thing that I mentioned earlier is that the statutory definition of renewable energy is very broad and not specific. It refers to energy produced using a technology that relies on a resource that is being consumed at a harvest rate at or below its natural regeneration rate. So the board needs to identify what technologies and fuel sources actually will qualify for the RES based on that definition. And then the other element is that because much of Tier 1 is expected to be met with existing resources, we are looking at ways to essentially automatically import all those resources and qualify them in Vermont, since they may not, and as a somewhat smaller market for RECs, there may not be a lot of interest in facilities going through the effort to qualify for the Vermont if it can't be done automatically. So with that, I will turn it over back to Mr. Nauer to talk about Tier 3.
Thank you, Kevin. So this time I will be talking about my own slides, thankfully. So this is the third tier of the Renewable Energy Standard, and these are either energy transformation projects or additional DG. So Kevin described how we have been convening working group meetings over the past number of months, and the same has been true for Tier 3. And again, we anticipate issuing at least 2 orders to implement Tier 3 prior to the rulemaking. So the purpose of Tier 3 is to encourage Vermont's retail electric providers to support either additional DG or other projects that would reduce the fossil fuel consumption of their customers. And the required amounts beginning January 2017, each utility have to have 2% of their annual retail sales, and this increases by an additional 0.2% each year until reaching 12% in January of 2032. And I should also say that utilities are able to bank their Tier 3 credits. So if they're long 1 year, they can carry those forward, and there is no time limitation for those Tier 3 credits. Looking at eligibility for Tier 3, if a utility were seeking to satisfy Tier 3 with additional distributed generation, the eligibility requirements would be the same as those described by Kevin for Tier 2. However, if a utility were looking at energy transformation projects, we have these 4 eligibility requirements. It needs to have commenced after January of 2015. It needs to result in a net reduction in fossil fuel consumption by the utility's customers, as well as greenhouse gas emissions. The project would need to meet the need for goods or services at the lowest present value life cycle cost, including consideration of environmental and economic costs. And an interesting twist, there's been a lot of discussion about so-called electrification measures, such as air-to-air heat pumps, which by their nature would increase electricity consumption. So when looking at this life cycle cost analysis, you need to consider alternatives that do not increase electricity consumption. And finally, again, we've got alternative compliance payment of 6 cents per kWh. So why is this important? Why are Vermont's electric utilities being given this task? Well, Vermont is a relatively cold rural state, which means we heat our homes and businesses and we drive a lot. Roughly 2/3 of Vermont's total energy use goes to space heating and transportation. So we use a lot of fossil fuels. But historically, Vermont has not had a robust source of funds to target the efficient use of fossil fuels. And so the hope is that these Tier 3 energy transformation projects will go some distance in addressing this shortfall of funding. So this is a relatively novel concept for us. These are some of my expectations or anticipations about how utilities will go about implementing their Tier 3 obligations. One thing is that they may seek prior regulatory approval of their projects. The statute required the board to provide a process for prior approval, and the working group meetings have spent a lot of time discussing this. And what the working group ultimately recommended is that the existing technical advisory group be given the task of reviewing utilities' proposed energy transformation projects. For those who aren't familiar with the technical advisory group, it consists of representatives of Vermont's energy efficiency utilities as well as the Department of Public Service. And historically, their charge has been to review and characterize energy efficiency measures. And so it seems like this was a natural fit to give them that task. Alternatively, if a utility didn't want to go through the TAG process, they could petition the board directly for prior approval. But there's no requirement that they obtain prior approval. But there may be some benefits to doing that, such as ensuring that projects meet the eligibility requirements, giving utilities confidence in savings expectations, or importantly, ensuring that savings are verifiable. A few things that the board continues to consider but hasn't issued a ruling on is it's likely that utilities will be required to file annual plans with the board explaining how they anticipate meeting the coming year's Tier 3 compliance requirements. And this, we hope, will foster collaboration with the energy efficiency utilities as well as with all of the utilities in the state. And we also anticipate that utilities will be required to file annual savings claims, which would then be reviewed, and ultimately the utilities would file annual compliance reports. Here are some of the outcomes that I anticipate. I think that the flexibility of Tier 3, which allows utilities to either obtain additional DG or engage in energy transformation projects, I think they will utilize that flexibility. There's a requirement that utilities engage with partners to implement their energy transformation projects unless those utilities can demonstrate that they are in a unique position to carry out the project or that they can do it more cost effectively than through a partnership. So I anticipate that utilities will engage a variety of partners, including our EEUs, the state weatherization agencies, home performance contractors, etc. And I also anticipate that utilities will undertake a variety of different projects to reduce their customers' fossil fuel consumption, weatherization, increased use of biofuels, as I mentioned earlier, air-to-air heat pumps, or geothermal heat pumps. And I anticipate that because we have many utilities, that they will have many different appearances and can approach this in many different ways, whether it be through incentives, unique financing structures, going out looking for bulk purchases and other ways that I haven't anticipated. Here's a few things that I think are really compelling, interesting, and also very complicating. We're a small state, but we have 17 different electric distribution companies, and each company has an exclusive service territory. However, the underlying law requires that ratepayers have an equitable opportunity to participate in these projects, regardless of rate class, income level, or service territory. So we have to work and determine what does it mean to have an equitable opportunity, and how do we ensure through a rulemaking that ratepayers have equitable opportunities regardless of service territory. So it's a complicated and very interesting thought exercise. Other things that I find interesting are, there are some very obvious type of energy transformation projects, but those obvious projects may not be the least cost option. So how does that play out in utilities decision-making and ultimately in rate cases? And then there are these electrification projects. They have additional requirements. For instance, a project must incorporate best practices for demand management. It must use a technology appropriate for Vermont, and it must encourage that the project's installation takes place in buildings that meet minimum energy performance standards. This is a very complicated problem. What does it mean to encourage? How does the board write a rule that ensures that encouragement is taking place? And just what are the best energy performance standards for us to adopt? Finally, given the novelty of this program, stakeholders have suggested that we conduct a review looking at the first 3 years of implementation. And this will give us an opportunity to learn from the first 3 years, look at how the regulatory process is working, share stakeholder perspectives, look at the efficacy of various Tier 3 programs, and also consider whether there are any statutory changes that would improve Tier 3 programs. And with that, thank you for having me, and I'm available to answer questions.
Hey, thanks very much, Tom. And I do have quite a few questions for all of our speakers here. Let me first ask one of Veronica. You talked about one of the goals being to increase the electrical connections between the islands. Are there any connections among any of the islands now, and how quickly is that going to change?
Sure. So no, in terms of electricity transmission, there are not. In terms of like cabling for telecommunications, there's many. In terms of how quickly that is going to happen, it really is a matter of PUC right now. There is a regulatory proceeding that has been open, I believe, since 2014, if not 2013, having to do with interconnecting Maui and Oahu through basically a two-way electricity transmission cable. That has been before the PUC for a bit now. It is one of the items that is being considered under the PSIP, the Power Supply Improvement Plan that I talked about. And I guess I also wanted to say that even though that's one of the interconnecting, modernizing our grids is one of the things that we would like to see. We are flexible, as in the State Energy Office is flexible, because we want to do it in a way that is going to be of greatest benefit to the state, and that may not necessarily mean interconnecting all of the islands. So we'll see as this Public Utilities Commission proceeding on the cable moves forward.
Good. Well, thank you. I'm going to ask you one more question, then I'll ask a couple of Vermont, and we'll keep going back and forth. But somebody was asking, you mentioned that there's clearly a lot of solar being installed in Hawaii. Is most of it utility scale, commercial, residential, a mix? What type of solar do you mostly have?
It's a mix. It's definitely a mix. I would say that the one that people talk most about is DG. I would say people in Hawaii really like PV, really like to incorporate it in their home. Certainly for the economic reasons, electricity here is 3 times as much as it is in the mainland. And so it gives customers or consumers an opportunity to greatly reduce their electricity bills. But I would also say that the people of Hawaii are very environmentally friendly and conscious, and I see them wanting to make that contribution as well. But yes, it is a combination of customer-sided, whether it's DG, commercial scale, as well as utility scale.
Good, thank you. And I have a question for Kevin, and partially for this question, Sam, can you put back the Vermont slides and go to the slide, it's about 5N, which gives the overall percentages for the new Vermont RPS for the different tiers. But Kevin, what one person was asking, you mentioned the $10 per megawatt RPS alternative compliance payment for Tier 1. Because that's so significantly lower than the alternative compliance payments in other states, do you see any negative implications for that?
Sure. I mean, I think the objective that the legislature had in mind in Tier 1 is to primarily encourage utilities to go after those lower cost RECs that are already on the existing market, and also to address or to bring in the significant hydropower component that is already in place in Vermont. So I think it is sort of less focused on encouraging the development of new renewable energy, which would be expected to in large part qualify for Tier 2, as so much to encourage utilities to contract for renewable energy that is already on the market. So in terms of whether that's going to be a challenge in sort of meeting what those statutory goals are, that may balance that out, if that answers the question.
Okay, thanks. Let me go back to a couple related to Hawaii. And biofuels is included in your list of renewables, but do you see it being likely that you'll get much biofuels generation in Hawaii?
Yes, so the first part of the question, biofuels, biomass is included. They're both included in our renewable energy definition. There is some biofuels production here in Hawaii. The tax credits that are being discussed in the legislature right now would help incentivize that local production as well.
Good. And how is the state dealing with the significant challenge of intermittent generation from renewables as you transition to not even 100%, but majority renewable power?
Sure. That's a multi-pronged approach. There's from the technical aspect, I talked about advanced inverter features. This is mainly for DG. There's the Reliability Standards Working Group and had basically commenced, several years ago. It got turned into, some things got implemented. already. Some things that were open issues moved into the distributed generation improvement plan and now part of the distributed energy resources. And so in terms of reliability from a safety, from a technical aspect, we've been dealing we've been working through those things in this DER, Distributed Energy Resources docket. In the Distributed Energy Resources docket, there is part of it involves looking at hosting capacity as well as system level capacity. The reason I mentioned Reliability Center's working group is that this new approach really was born back in those days as a quote-unquote proactive approach. And it's a new way of planning. What it does is that it says, okay, so this is how much DG penetration from PV we are anticipating. So if we proactively plan for that, what sort of issues are we going to have? How much available capacity do we have before we start seeing issues in the various circuits? And so once you identify that, then you can say, all right, let's assume we maximize all of the penetration. What sort of issues would we then be having on a system level? And so then from there, it becomes an iterative process of what are the technical challenges that need to be overcoming those technical challenges, opening up a bit more hosting capacity, then looking what sort of technical challenges emerge, and so on and so forth. So that's just like on the technical side. And there's a lot of other initiatives that I just don't even have time to go into. But also on the planning side, at a higher level, the Power Supply Improvement Plan is also looking at the integration of distributed energy and the resource planning. And then we're also looking at it from a pricing perspective, looking at new mechanisms like, well, how do we handle this duck curve through things like time of use rates and dynamic pricing? So it really is a multi-pronged approach. There's a lot of people, a lot of stakeholders beyond the utility and the Public Utilities Commission working on this together.
Thank you. I'm going to ask a couple of Vermont questions, but before I do that, I do want to respond to a couple people who wrote in asking about, can you get the full sets of slides? The full webinar recording will be up on our website, CISA.org. The slide sets will be available to you to download on our website as well at CISA.org. So my Vermont question here, and this follows up to some extent from the issue of some of these other technologies for dealing with intermittency in Hawaii. In Vermont, Green Mountain Power is now offering storage. Do you see storage as an important component of goals to increase clean energy in your state?
Go ahead, Kevin.
No, that's fine. I mean, I don't know if you want to talk about the potential in Tier 3. I don't know.
Yeah, I'll just say that storage could be an eligible resource in Tier 3. The working groups haven't discussed that very much, but certainly if that were a technology that was analyzed and reviewed by the technical advisory group and was cost-effective and otherwise met eligibility requirements, certainly it could be a player for GMP.
And I think to jump on that more broadly, I don't think storage has been discussed at great length in the context of the overall RES shift to renewables. In part because, a large share of that is from relatively less intermittent sources, to the extent that we are already a large share hydropower, that doesn't pose quite the same intermittency challenges as something like solar. But that said, I mean, we're seeing higher rates of solar penetration in Vermont, and I think there's an interest among all of our utilities in thinking about how, as we get further down this path, how we're going to respond to that.
And I have another question for you, Kevin, and somebody was asking about your comments about the difficulty with Canadian Hydro and NEPOOL GIS. This person wants you to elaborate on that because he says it seems NEPOOL GIS already tracks imports for the rest of the region. So what's the difference with tracking Canadian Hydro?
So the challenge specifically is that Vermont utilities have contracts with Hydro-Quebec Power Supply that specify a certain renewable content. And annually, Hydro-Quebec sends our utilities an attestation statement that essentially says, you know, of the power we provided you, X% of it is hydropower. Those values tend not to reflect what NEPOOL GIS assigns the imports, which assign it based on Quebec's overall system mix. So it's that discrepancy between those figures that's the challenge we are faced with resolving.
Okay, and here's a question for both Hawaii and Vermont, and this person's asking about whether through your RPSs or through other programs, do you have any mechanisms for directing distributed generation or other distributed resource projects towards places on the transmission and distribution system where they could provide the most system benefits? You know, is that being done for generators, for storage, demand response, microgrid? Is there any, you know, are there any mechanisms for trying to direct things to where the system needs it most?
Sure. This is Veronica. I would say that we talked a little bit about hosting capacity and system level capacity. A lot of the circuits in Hawaii are already very saturated. So I feel that hosting capacity provides some clues, very clear, strong clues as to other circuits that are less saturated, where there is more hosting capacity. And in one of the previous filings, I believe for the Distributed Energy Resources docket, the HECO companies provided the circuits, and then also how much open capacity they still had. So that was really helpful. And then from a signals perspective, we're also starting to move towards things like time of use rates, also as like indicators, not so much of like where systems ought to be placed, but more so what types of systems we'd like to see that are going to be grid supportive instead of working against the grid.
This is Tom Nauer.
Yeah.
I'll jump in from the Vermont perspective. We have the standard offer program. Some of the attendees may be familiar with that. Basically, that is for in-state projects that are 2.2 megawatts and below. And over the entire program, the size will be, I think, 127.5 megawatts. And we allocate a certain number of megawatts each year. This year, 2016, it'll be 7.5 megawatts. The underlying statute says there needs to be a process to look at places where standard offer projects would provide sufficient benefit to the electric grid. And obviously the statute didn't define what sufficient benefit means. So the board has interpreted that to mean if a standard offer project could address a reliability constraint at either the distribution, sub-transmission, or transmission level. And so we do have a process that I believe goes directly to the question that you were asking, Warren, whereby each year all of the state's electric utilities need to look at where they have reliability constraints. When they identify those, they submit information to the Vermont System Planning Committee, and there's a screening process that asks the question, can that reliability constraint be addressed by a non-transmission alternative? If the answer is yes, then that utility is required to submit a plan about how they're going to address the constraint considering non-transmission alternatives. And that could include additional energy efficiency that is targeted at the load served by the part of the system where there is the constraint. It could be addressed by locating standard offer projects near that circuit. It could include just utility operating mechanisms. So that's kind of a long answer. Yes, Vermont does have a process for locating DG in ways that would benefit the grid.
Okay, good. I'm going to ask one more Hawaii question, one more Vermont question, and then I'll give folks an opportunity if there's anything else you want to say before we close the webinar. My Hawaii question, somebody was asking, you discussed that you're going to be moving away from an RPS definition that focuses on sales and moving towards electricity generation. Is this purely a small technical fix, or does this have significant implications for what happens in the state?
Sure. And to clarify, it's currently before the legislature, and it would require the legislature to amend the definition for us to be able to move forward with that. We consider that like a technical bookkeeping type of amendment. If we were to look at, for example, the 2014 RPS under current definition, which is about 21% actual, with the amended definition in which it would be renewable energy generation divided by total generation, we'd be looking at 19% instead. So we would say that the change is nominal. However, as we look into the future, and we're looking to add a lot more DG, as was laid out in the utilities plans, then that gap of current definition versus proposed definition, the gap becomes a lot bigger. And so we're trying to be proactive. We're trying to fix this before it becomes a substantial issue.
Okay, thank you. And my last Vermont question is, this may be too soon to know, but will Vermont likely see a benefit from the recent cooperation agreement between the U.S. and Canada? Is that anything you're looking at and considering as you go forward with your planning?
This is Tom.
Go ahead.
I would say that has not been an item that we've been discussing so far as we've considered the initial implementation of the RES, and I'll let Kevin supplement as he sees fit.
That is exactly what I was going to say.
Okay, good. So do any of you folks have any famous last words, anything else you want to say that you didn't get a chance to say up till now?
Yeah, this is Tom from Vermont. The standard offer projects that I was discussing a couple of minutes ago, they would certainly just be eligible for the RES Tier 2, so it would kind of be serving a couple purposes. And finally, I'm open to discussing this further with any of my colleagues around the country.
Hi, this is Veronica. Similarly, really excited about what is happening in Hawaii. We're happy to share, what we know, what we're doing, but also very happy to learn from others around, the state that are working on, similar renewable energy and portfolio standard achievement goals. And lastly, thank you so much to CISA, Warren, and Sam for giving us this opportunity to be here today.
And I'll just echo those comments for myself as well.
Good. Well, thank you all. Both you've had interesting things to say and explained what your states are up to well, but more important than that, you folks are really doing some path-breaking things in your state, and it's good for those of us in other parts of the country to be monitoring what's going on in Hawaii and Vermont and to learn from you. So thank you very much, and we will be back with more RPS collaborative webinars in the future. So thank you.